the Fulda Gap, West Germany, September 1961. The ground trembled under the weight of Soviet T-55 tanks rolling through the Thuringian Forest, their diesel engines churning black smoke into autumn air. NATO officers stood in observation posts watching the war game unfold, stopwatches in hand, calculating the mathematics of annihilation. The exercise was called Checkmate Four, and by hour 48, the Warsaw Pact forces had pushed through the Fulda corridor and reached the Rhine. The West had lost World War III before the weekend ended. The problem was arithmetic that no amount of courage could solve. Soviet armored divisions numbered over 25,000 tanks arrayed along the Iron Curtain. NATO could field perhaps 6,000, spread thin across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Alps. The Fulda Gap, a natural corridor through the German highlands just 60 miles wide, represented the highway to Western Europe. Through that bottleneck, Soviet doctrine called for 3 armored armies to punch westward at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. British forces positioned in the Northern Army Group sector would face the initial avalanche. The Royal Air Force carried the impossible burden. Ground forces could not stop the assault. Nuclear weapons would turn Allied territory into radioactive wasteland. Air power remained the only answer, but the aircraft available were relics of a different war. English electric Canberras, designed in the late 1940s, cruised at altitudes where Soviet surface-to-air missiles could swat them from the sky like flies. Avro Vulcan bombers carried nuclear gravity bombs but lacked the precision to hit mobile tank columns without obliterating German cities. The V-bomber force was built for strategic bombardment of Soviet cities, not tactical strikes against armored spearheads racing through Frankfurt. Harold Macmillan's government understood the dilemma with crystalline clarity. Britain needed an aircraft that could fly, below radar coverage, survive in contested airspace, deliver weapons with surgical precision against moving targets, and do all of this in the pitch darkness of a European winter night. The technology required did not exist in any operational aircraft on Earth. The Soviet breakthrough would come at dawn, hidden by morning fog, protected by mobile SAM batteries and MiG interceptors. Existing RAF strike aircraft would be flying coffins. Then Robert McNamara announced the TFX program. The American Secretary of Defense had ordered the development of a single fighter design to serve both the Air Force and Navy, a revolutionary concept promising revolutionary capabilities. Variable sweep wings would allow high-speed dash at Mach 2 and slow-speed carrier approaches. Terrain following radar would permit flight at 200 feet above ground in total darkness. Internal weapons bays would carry conventional or nuclear ordnance. The specifications read like science fiction. An aircraft that could fly from British bases, penetrate Soviet air defenses at treetop level, identify individual tanks with onboard radar, and destroy them with precision-guided weapons before the crews knew death was overhead. British defense planners saw salvation. In May 1963, Britain signed a Memorandum of Understanding to purchase 50 aircraft, designated F-111K. The order represented 10% of the RAF's annual budget, but the capability gap demanded the expense. Finally, an answer to the Fulda Gap existed. Finally, a weapon that could blunt the armored tide without incinerating Europe. The contract was signed, the deposits paid, Britain's strategic future mortgaged to American aerospace engineering. The aircraft that would save Britain was already doomed. They just didn't know it yet. General Dynamics, Fort Worth, Texas, 1964. Engineers gathered around wind tunnel models of an aircraft that defied conventional aerodynamics. The wings moved, not flaps or ailerons, but the entire wing assembly, sweeping from 16 degrees for takeoff and landing to 72.5 degrees for supersonic dash. Hydraulic actuators the size of telephone poles pivoted the wing box through the fuselage, redistributing the aircraft's center of gravity while maintaining control. No production aircraft had ever attempted this. The F-111 would make it routine. The variable sweep mechanism solved the fundamental contradiction of modern jet combat. Straight wings provided lift at low speeds but created catastrophic drag above Mach 1. Swept wings enabled supersonic flight but demanded dangerously high landing speeds. The F-111's wing pivoted to match the mission phase, transforming the aircraft's aerodynamic personality in flight. The system added 8,000 pounds of complexity. hydraulic lines spiderwebbing through the fuselage, but it delivered an aircraft that could loiter at 200 knots or sprint at 1,500. The terrain-following radar represented an even more audacious leap. The Pratt & Whitney system fired electromagnetic pulses ahead of the aircraft, mapping terrain elevation in a corridor 5 miles forward. The computer processed returns in milliseconds, calculating a flight path that hugged ground contours while maintaining 200 feet of clearance. When the pilot engaged the system, control passed to the machine. At 600 miles per hour, human reaction time was inadequate. The radar flew the aircraft through valleys, over ridgelines, around obstacles that appeared as black masses in the darkness. The crew sat side by side, watching instruments as the aircraft twisted through terrain that would kill them if the radar failed. The numbers dazzled NATO planners. Maximum range exceeded 3,800 miles with external fuel tanks. Top speed reached Mach 2.5 at altitude. The internal weapons bay could carry 31,500 pounds of ordnance, everything from Mark 82 conventional bombs to the B-43 nuclear gravity bomb yielding 1 megaton. The F-111 could strike targets in Poland while taking off from British airfields, delivering more firepower than an entire squadron of Canberras. Britain's 50 F-111K variants included specific modifications. The nose stretched 18 inches to accommodate British reconnaissance equipment. The weapons bay was reconfigured for the WE-177 nuclear bomb, Britain's primary tactical nuclear weapon. Additional fuel tanks extended range for North Sea operations. The estimated program cost reached £425 million in 1965 currency, but the capability justified the expense. Britain was purchasing an aircraft that would define RAF strike operations for 3 decades. The first cracks appeared in weight growth projections. The aircraft was gaining mass faster than thrust improvements could compensate. Early estimates projected an empty weight of 37,000 pounds. By late 1964, that figure had climbed past 47,000. The added weight from strengthened landing gear, enlarged fuel tanks, and heavier avionics created a cascade of engineering compromises. Performance specifications slipped. The first test flight, scheduled for early 1964, was delayed until December. The Navy variant, designated F-111B, struggled during carrier trials. The aircraft designed for aircraft carriers couldn't land on them reliably. Development costs were rising. The original $5.2 billion program estimate climbed past $7 billion. Each modification triggered supply chain disruptions, tooling changes, and schedule delays. Britain had ordered a miracle. America was struggling to build it. But the real problems weren't engineering. They were strategic. Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, and suddenly the F-111's mission changed. The aircraft Britain ordered to stop Soviet tanks in Germany was now needed to penetrate North Vietnamese air defenses. The Air Force watched fighter bombers get shredded by surface-to-air missiles over Hanoi and saw the F-111 as salvation. The jungle war couldn't wait for European contingencies. Vietnam demanded the aircraft now. The first combat deployment launched in March 1968 under the code name Combat Lancer. 6 F-111As flew from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada to Tackley Royal Thai Air Force Base, crossing the Pacific in stages. The terrain-following radar that promised to revolutionize European warfare would now thread aircraft through Vietnamese mountain valleys at night. On March 28th, one aircraft disappeared over North Vietnam. The crew vanished. No distress call, no wreckage found. On April 22nd, a second F-111 failed to return from a mission near Hanoi. Mechanical failure was suspected, but unconfirmed. On April 30th, a third aircraft went missing. 3 losses in 33 days. The entire fleet was grounded. Investigators traced the failures to hydraulic system malfunctions. Welded joints in the horizontal stabilizer actuators were cracking under stress, causing complete control loss at low altitude. The terrain-following radar worked perfectly, guiding the aircraft through darkness at treetop height, but when hydraulics failed, there was no recovery time. The aircraft flew into the ground before pilots could react. The miracle machine was killing its own crews. Meanwhile, costs were exploding like ordnance in a supply depot. The per-unit price had climbed from $5.8 million in 1965 to $11.8 million by 1968. Britain's total program cost now exceeded £700 million. nearly 10% of the entire Royal Air Force annual budget. The aircraft that was supposed to arrive in 1968 wouldn't be delivered until 1970 at the earliest, and even that timeline was optimistic. Britain's economy was collapsing under its own weight. In November 1967, the pound sterling was devalued from $2.80 to $2.40, a humiliating admission of fiscal crisis. Defense Secretary Dennis Healey began a sweeping review, cutting Britain's military commitments east of Suez. The government faced impossible choices: aircraft carriers, a replacement for the canceled TSR-2 bomber, or the F-111K. The budget could not support all three. Cabinet meetings through late 1967 dissected the F-111 program like surgeons over a dying patient. The costs kept rising, the delivery dates kept slipping, the Vietnam losses suggested the aircraft might not survive combat. On January 16, 1968, Prime Minister Harold Wilson stood in Parliament and announced the cancellation. Britain would not purchase the F-111K. 50 partially built aircraft sat in Fort Worth, Texas, components scattered across factory floors. General Dynamics scrapped them for parts. The penalty clause was brutal. Britain paid $200 million for aircraft that would never be delivered, compensation for broken contracts and disrupted production lines. 50 airframes built to British specifications were dismantled, their swing wings and terrain-following radars harvested for American variants. It was the most expensive cancellation in British military history, money paid for empty promises. Britain had escaped the F-111. America was just beginning to understand what it had built. The hydraulic problems were fixed, and F-111S returned to Vietnam in September 1972. Between 1968 and 1973, 6 aircraft were lost in combat, a loss rate that exceeded the older F-4 Phantoms flying the same missions. The terrain-following radar performed exactly as designed, but crews often flew above the safe altitude because they didn't trust the machine. Mechanical reliability remained inconsistent. The aircraft could execute missions no other platform could attempt, threading through mountain valleys in total darkness, but the cost per sortie was astronomical compared to conventional alternatives. A single F-111 strike cost more in maintenance, fuel, and operational overhead than an entire flight of F-4s achieving similar results. The maintenance crews logged over 60 hours of work for every flight hour, more than double the F-4's requirement. The Navy canceled the F-111B entirely in 1968. The carrier variant was simply too heavy. Aircraft that weighed over 50,000 pounds empty couldn't reliably land on carrier decks in rough seas. The entire premise of the TFX program, commonality between Air Force and Navy variants to reduce costs through shared components, proved illusory. Each service wanted fundamentally different aircraft. The Air Force needed a strike bomber. The Navy needed a fleet interceptor. Forcing both missions into one airframe created a Frankenstein that satisfied neither requirement. The cost savings McNamara promised through joint procurement evaporated in engineering compromises. Senator William Proxmire's investigation opened in 1968, dissecting the procurement process with surgical precision. Testimony revealed political pressure on the contract award. Boeing had submitted a technically superior proposal, but General Dynamics won the contract through channels that suggested favoritism. The F-111 became a symbol of everything broken in military acquisition, a program driven by political expedience rather than operational necessity. The hearings filled newspapers for months, each revelation more damaging than the last. The disaster triggered fundamental changes in how America bought weapons. Congress mandated new oversight procedures requiring competitive prototyping before production commitments. The doctrine of concurrency, building aircraft while still testing them, came under fierce scrutiny. The F-111 had been ordered into production before the design was validated, creating a situation where hundreds of aircraft required retrofits to fix problems discovered during operational testing. Future programs like the F-14 Tomcat, F-15 Eagle, and F-16 Fighting Falcon deliberately avoided joint service requirements, each aircraft optimized for a single mission rather than compromised across multiple roles. By 1973, the F-111 actually worked. The bugs were fixed. The terrain-following radar performed reliably. Crews trusted the system. In the final months of Vietnam operations, F-111s flew precision, strikes that would have been impossible for any other aircraft, but success came too late to save Britain's order, too late to justify the enormous cost, and too late to redeem the program's reputation. The aircraft had become operational a decade after it was promised, at twice the projected cost, with half the planned fleet size. The F-111 finally performed as promised. But the damage was institutional, not technical. The aircraft had destroyed something more important than its own reputation. It had shattered the assumption that technology could be scheduled like factory production, that joint requirements produced efficient solutions, and that American aerospace engineering could deliver miracles on demand. The revolution arrived, but the war had already moved on. Britain lost more than 50 aircraft. When the F-111K was cancelled, the Royal Air Force was left without a credible tactical nuclear delivery system for the European theater. The TSR-2, Britain's indigenous strike aircraft, had been cancelled in 1965. The F-111K was cancelled in 1968. Between those two decisions, the RAF found itself operating aging Vulcan bombers designed for strategic bombardment, not tactical strikes against mobile armored columns. The capability gap Britain had desperately tried to fill remained wide open. Soviet tank divisions still massed along the Fulda Gap, and Britain had no answer that didn't involve strategic nuclear weapons. The emergency substitution was the F-4 Phantom, ordered in 1968 as a stopgap solution. The Phantom was a capable aircraft, proven in Vietnam, reliable in all-weather operations, but it lacked terrain-following radar. It lacked the all-weather precision strike capability that made the F-111 revolutionary. Britain was essentially purchasing 1950s technology in 1968, filling the gap with an aircraft that couldn't execute the mission the F-111K was designed for. The strategic vulnerability widened. NATO's northern flank remained exposed to conventional assault with no effective counter beyond escalation to theater nuclear weapons. The cancellation's ripple effects spread across the Atlantic Alliance. West Germany watched Britain retreat from advanced procurement programs and questioned the reliability of Allied commitments. France, already pursuing an independent nuclear deterrent under de Gaulle, saw confirmation that European defense could not depend on American technology transfers. The United States, having promised Britain a revolutionary capability and delivered only cost overruns and delays, suffered a credibility crisis as an equipment supplier. Joint procurement programs became politically suspect for the next decade. The F-111 failure killed an entire approach to international defense cooperation. When Britain began developing the Tornado strike aircraft in the late 1960s, it deliberately partnered with Germany and Italy, excluding the United States entirely. The program structure reflected lessons learned from the F-111 disaster. European partners would share development costs, work share would be distributed equitably, and no single nation could unilaterally alter requirements or timelines. The Atlantic defense relationship gave way to European alternatives, a direct consequence of the F-111's broken promises. The strategic doctrine built around the F-111 collapsed along with the aircraft. NATO's flexible response strategy, adopted in 1967, required the ability to counter Soviet conventional aggression with precision conventional strikes. The F-111 was the weapon system designed specifically for this mission, the technological bridge between capitulation and nuclear escalation. Without it, NATO faced a binary choice during any Warsaw Pact offensive: either accept defeat or launch nuclear weapons. The Fulda Gap problem that had driven Britain to order the F-111K in 1963 remained unsolved until precision-guided munitions became operational in the 1980s, nearly 2 decades later. British aerospace independence accelerated its decline. The cancellation fee, $200 million for nothing, represented capital that could have funded indigenous development. The phrase "American solutions to British problems" became politically toxic, invoked whenever procurement decisions favored transatlantic purchases over European collaboration. Future RAF programs, from the Tornado to the Eurofighter Typhoon, reflected a fundamental shift away from dependence on American aerospace technology. The F-111 finally proved itself in one theater, but it would take another war to reveal what it had really destroyed. Desert Storm, January 1991, F-111F, strike aircraft lifted from bases in Saudi Arabia. Their swing wings swept forward for takeoff, then pivoting backward as they accelerated toward a rocky airspace. The terrain-following radar that had struggled in Vietnamese jungles performed flawlessly in desert conditions, guiding aircraft through sandstorms and total darkness while other coalition aircraft sat grounded. Over 40 nights, F-111s flew more than 2,500 sorties, striking hardened bunkers, command centers, and armored formations with precision that exceeded every other platform in the theater. The success rate approached 80% target destruction, numbers that vindicated every promise made 3 decades earlier. The mission profile Britain needed in 1963 was finally being executed perfectly in 1991. Low-level penetration of heavily defended airspace, all-weather precision, strikes against mobile targets, terrain-following flight through contested environments, but Britain wasn't flying them. The Royal Air Force watched from the sidelines, operating Tornadoes that performed adequately but lacked the F-111's unique capabilities. The 23-year gap between promise and performance had cost Britain the most effective strike aircraft of the war. If the F-111K had been delivered on schedule at the promised cost, it would have been revolutionary. Instead, it arrived a generation too late in American hands. The final accounting was devastating. The total F-111 program consumed over $12 billion in 1970s currency, equivalent to triple that amount in modern terms. Britain's penalty payment, $200 million for aircraft never delivered, represented the largest cancellation fee in military procurement history. The NATO capability gap persisted from 1968 until the Tornado reached initial operational capability in 1985. 17 years of strategic vulnerability during the Cold War's most dangerous period. The uncertainty that gap created, the questions it raised about NATO's ability to respond to conventional aggression without nuclear escalation, shaped Soviet strategic calculations throughout the 1970s. But the real destruction wasn't measured in dollars or aircraft. The F-111 killed trust in joint international procurement programs. It shattered British aerospace independence by consuming budgets that could have funded indigenous alternatives. It destroyed the Atlantic Defense Equipment Partnership, pushing European nations toward collaborative programs that deliberately excluded American industry. It collapsed the doctrine of tactical nuclear deterrence, leaving NATO strategically exposed for nearly 2 decades. And it demolished the illusion that technology development could be scheduled with industrial precision, that engineering challenges would yield to program deadlines and budget projections. The last F-111 retired from Air Force service in December 1998, 30 years after it should have entered British service. The aircraft had finally proven itself capable and effective, executing missions in Desert Storm, Kosovo, and Afghanistan that no other platform could attempt. But it never escaped the trauma of its birth, the cost overruns and schedule delays that poisoned its reputation before the first aircraft reached operational status. The F-111 worked eventually, but only after destroying its own strategic purpose. The sound of an F-111's afterburners lighting for the final time echoed across the Nevada desert. The swing wings swept forward one last time. The aircraft that could do what nothing else could do lifted off, carrying the corpse of a doctrine that had died decades earlier. They sent it to save Britain. It arrived 30 years too late. Its mission obsolete, its promise broken. The F-111 didn't fail because it didn't work. It failed because it worked too well, too late, and cost too much. Britain escaped. America paid for a revolution in warfare that arrived after the war had changed. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My friend, who is a commercial pilot, said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories about airlines and the realities of modern travel like this deserve to be told. Help me show her that these videos matter. Please subscribe to the channel and let's keep these stories from being buried.